I'm going to turn it over to Tom Haynes, who is our moderator for the evening.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome through the wonders of Zoom back to UNH for what I think is going to be an informative and compelling discussion with three distinguished alums who bring a remarkable range of journalism experience back to campus. Before we get to that discussion, I'd like to begin by asking each of you to take an anonymous poll answering three questions about news and social media habits that will help us get a little bit of a sense of where we're coming from. So Phoebe, who is going to help run things behind the scenes, will post those poll questions now. And audience members, you should see a prompt on screen to enter your answers. We'll wait about a minute as we start to see the results come in. All right, so yeah, give that a quick look here. So yeah, I think the 2 points I would make just looking at this, and let me move this out of the way so I can see. Yeah, the first one is that these answers demonstrate to some degree a major shift in how we encounter news in our daily lives. From an old world in which newspapers, radios, and television were essentially the methods through which we learn news and information each day. And obviously, as the poll shows, they still are out there. But we've arrived at this new world in which we're all networked, right? We may find our news on those older platforms, but we also find it online, news websites, 60% of respondents put in, and also notably through social media, right? Where we also encounter so much other information. The second thing I would just point out from the poll is it shows the extent to which, to varying degrees, we're all present in this exchange of information, participating and contributing through our own activities on social media to the information ecosystem that we've come to live in 2020. Kevin Kelly, a technology journalist and the founder of Wired magazine, told the BBC in an article about this shift to a socially woven information world, quote, "The major new challenge in reporting news is the new shape of truth. Truth is no longer dictated by authorities, but is networked by peers," close quote. The problem that complicates that challenge, of course, is that this widening of the information ecosystem has brought with it an explosion of misinformation and disinformation in our online networks, and therefore in society. And that includes everything from a mistakenly shared bit of gossip to the intentional spread of false facts in which individuals and organizations seeking power or profit target different sides of our deeply divided society. Amid all of this, still stand journalists aiming to fulfill the long-held goal of informing the public about what is happening around them. In hundreds of newsrooms around this country, every day, reporters and editors practice that scientific method of journalism. They conduct original work to verify facts and then to share that transparently with their audience, citing sources and evidence. But what does this shift to a networked information world and the explosion of disinformation within it mean for journalists? How does it impact how they do their jobs and the role they play in society? And what does this shift mean for you, the audience, and for all of us as consumers of news? For answers and elaboration on these and other questions, I'm excited that we are joined tonight by such a compelling panel of UNH alumni, all veteran journalists with a range of experience. I'll introduce each of them in a moment, but first, just a quick note about how tonight's conversation will work. For roughly the next 30 minutes, I'll pose a series of questions to the panelists. giving them the opportunity to share their perspective and joining conversation together about these topics. During that time, you'll have the opportunity using the Q&A feature. You should see the button at the bottom of your Zoom screen to submit questions. We'll then turn to about 20 minutes of audience questions where I'll sort of select from the Q&A entries and pose those to the panelists. And I expect we'll wrap up by about 8 o'clock or just a bit after. There's obviously a lot to talk about. So on to our panelists. Natalie Jacobson, UNH class of 1965, is a veteran news anchor who spent much of her career at WCVB TV in Boston. She points out that she began her television career by assessing the needs of the community with in-person interviews, then offering programming suggestions to meet those needs. During more than 30 years, she covered the biggest stories in Boston and around New England. Mark Fortier, UNH class of 1995, got his start covering rugby for the New Hampshire and hosted a sports talk show on WUNH. He's worked for Foster's Daily Democrat, the Salem News and Eagle Tribune newspapers, before pivoting to online news almost a decade ago, helping to launch local patch online sites in New Hampshire before joining NBC 10 Boston, New England Cable News, and Telemundo Boston, where he serves as their digital director. And Ella Nilsson, UNH class of 2013, began her reporting career at the Concord Monitor and Keene Sentinel newspapers before moving to the online news site Vox. As a politics and policy reporter, Ella covers Congress, as well as the past 2 presidential elections and 7 US Senate races in the 2020 cycle. Her explanatory reporting focuses on human implications of politics and policy. And on to the questions. My first question for our panelists, it really, before we get too much to disinformation and its impact, is just to ask each of you to share, and maybe we'll start with Natalie, to share a bit from your perspective, how this technological and social shift to a networked world has changed journalism and how it works, perhaps sharing a few pros and cons as you see it. So Natalie, do you want to take it away?
Okay, Tom. Well, gosh, I started in this business when television was in its infancy, when it was at its genesis. And, we kind of made it up as we went along. But one thing, I think the main difference of then and now is your story, your information is only as good as your source. And people need to remember that. People say, hey, I heard that such and such happened. I said, really? Where'd you hear that? Well, I read it on the internet. Well, who wrote it? Oh, I don't know. That's something that people need to pay attention to, because obviously there's a lot of good information out there, but you need to be your own editor. We used to be your editor. We did the work for you. We sifted through fact from fiction. That was our job. That's what we got paid to do. We tried to be fair. You alluded to my first jobs in television. Well, there was a time when the Federal Communications Commission licensed television stations, and those television stations had to renew their license every 3 years. And to get your license renewed, you had to prove that you were fair over the course of the 3 years on issues. You had to prove that you gave equal time to the candidates. So my first job, being a rookie who knew absolutely nothing, so I spent 6 months ascertaining the needs of the community. That was the language of the FCC directive. And so what the advantage of that was, I got to know who we were talking to. Who are they? What do they worry about? How do they educate their children? When they go to sleep at night, what do they think about? What do they want from their government? What do they want from their television station? So what happened as television evolved in the early years in the 60s and 70s, and then moving into the 80s, was we programmed to a need. It was controversy over an issue. Let me take, in this neighborhood, probably you would remember, the Seabrook nuclear power plant. Well, there were people who said it was spewing toxic materials. People were worried in New Hampshire, Rye, and up the coast in that area. We took the entire news department up there, spent a week interviewing people, from the engineers to the people who worked in the plant, to the people in Washington who were writing the policy. And by the end of the week, we were able, to the best of our ability, to say to the viewers, especially of New Hampshire and Massachusetts, here's what we learned. Here's what you need to be afraid of, and here's what you don't. That was the way it was done back then.
Mark, let me ask you, just because you began your career when in those days, sort of that time scale is familiar, where news organizations had a little more control to do that in-depth work. They still can do that work, but it's a totally different environment in terms of speed and time right now. Obviously, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and I mean, and that's the key, is that when I was in newspapers, you know, you might write one story, 2 stories a day. At Foster's, maybe 6 stories a day, but at most newspapers, a story or 2 a day, you know, max. And so you really had time to dig into things. You had time, you know, I used to spend half my day at City Hall, just sitting in people's offices, having conversations with them. And you're right, the speed of it has changed everything. So now, you know, we're looking to get 2 lines of a story up, and then develop it from there. Where in the past you would boil the entire story before you even presented it to it. Even then, you might be, you know, told to go back and talk to 5 more people before it would ever end up in the paper. And right now, it's more kind of like build as you go. And to a lot of extent, a lot of the content gets like 1 read and is up quickly, and then is out before people's eyes. And that's at NBC. So there are a lot of, you know, bloggers and you know, people on social media who are just putting things out quickly. So it's made things easier in a lot of ways, because I can put together a pretty well-sourced story from behind a desk, which has come in really handy in these times, without having to, you know, go down and do a ton of on-the-ground interviews. But at the same time, it's there's a lot of time spent sifting through information to find out what's actually accurate, because there are people out there actively trying to deceive journalists, using, you know, fake Twitter accounts that are one letter off of a real source's Twitter account, trying to trick people into picking up a story. So it's made it easier in that, you know, we can gather a lot more information quickly, because we have, you know, sources who are reporting information constantly on social media, but verifying that information has become that much tougher, because a lot of these people are faceless, and we're not interacting with them face to face, and there's no consequences if they, you know, give us a piece of information, it turns out not to be true. In the past, I would go back to that City Hall the next day,
Right.
and, you know, hey, you burned me. What are you doing? And trust them again. It's a lot tougher now, because you just have that information coming from so many sources.
Mm-hmm. Ella, how about you? What do you see in the political world, where I imagine all this is amped up even further in terms of speed and sourcing and all that, those challenges?
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, you know, we've been seeing in the last 4 years, especially, you know, dealing with misinformation coming directly from, you know, the White House and the office of the president, and some of his main allies. And certainly that's not, you know, misinformation is not a purely Republican issue. It's not a purely partisan thing. It certainly comes from both political sides. One of the things that I was thinking of as Natalie and Mark were talking is, and one of the things that I have been thinking about a lot, especially over the last 4 years, is ways that the news media can better explain everything that we as journalists know and are taught, you know, when we're in early in our careers or at journalism school, or, you know, as we were all taught at UNH, you know, basic tenets of media literacy and, you know, how we get stories, how sourcing happens. And one of the big things that I think sometimes gets lost, especially in social media, when there's so much, you know, so many articles being shared and so many things being shared, is that sometimes it gets hard to distinguish between what's the hard news and what is somebody's opinion. And sometimes even on places like the New York Times, which literally, you know, the main page of the New York Times, there you can see, like, they very clearly say, you know, this is the opinion section, and then they have the news side. But sometimes I think that the average news consumer that isn't really steeped in this stuff and doesn't do it for work, it sometimes can be really hard to distinguish between something that is a reported, you know, objective story versus something that is somebody's opinion. And I work at a website, Vox, that definitely, I would say, has the reputation of when it started as sort of being a site that had people on the left that would sort of write articles based off of their own opinion. I come in as a journalist, and I try to do everything that I'm doing grounded in what people are telling me on the ground. I'm currently, you know, reporting on the Georgia Senate races. was on the phone last night with, sources in Georgia until about 7 at night. So everything that I am doing is grounded in reporting, but sometimes not everything on our website is, and it sometimes can be sort of tough to distinguish between the two. And so I think that it is really incumbent, whether it's the site that I work for or the New York Times or any other site, to maybe explain a little bit more to the average news consumer how we do our jobs and sort of which is which, I guess.
Well, you bring up an interesting point about, separating fact from fiction, or rather fact from opinion. And I think from my point of view, there's just so much opinion now, and opinion wasn't allowed for many years in television, as I'm sure you know. And we had editorials, and we labeled them as such. And usually it was the station manager who said, this is my opinion. And you were right, in the New York Times or Washington Post or Chicago Tribune, Los Angeles, whichever, the front page used to be, you could pretty much rely on it being factual information, and turn to the opinion pages and get your opinion. And I think you're right, Ella, that the New York Times in particular, which is a great source of angst to me as a longtime journalist, to see that they are so one-sided in most of their reporting that it's sad. It's just hard to find good information today. I think you have to really work at it.
Let me ask you,
and how many people have the time? You have families, you have jobs. We used to do that for you. I trusted you to be my mechanic, or to fix my toilet, or, run my finances. And you trusted me to bring you information. And now everybody's in the pool. It's hard.
Yeah, it's a crowded swimming pool. Let me ask, Ella and Mark, so how do journalists in your newsrooms sort of meet that challenge of letting people know, right? I mean, like you said, Ella, like the standards you're following are the same time-honored things you've always done, going out and finding sources and verifying that. But, how do you sort of establish that your stories are based in fact? How do you let readers know? I mean, transparency is a big part of it, I'm sure, but I mean, are there certain things that you think of in knowing that your stories are going out on social media platforms and are kind of getting thrown into the pool, so to speak?
I would say it's tough. I mean, the reporters don't spend a lot of time publicly trying to distance themselves. NBC reporters don't spend a lot of time trying to distance themselves, saying, hey, this is not MSNBC. I know they're very liberal bent. We're not the same as them. But we do spend a lot of time defending ourselves. When we see people in public, when reporters are out reporting stories, there's a lot of that, NBC's very liberal. And so they think that we're, a certain arm of the company. But I think for the most part, being part of a larger news organization helps. What's happened here, as you have all these, greater sources of news, is that people still go to their trusted news sources. So I think being with an NBC or a Vox, or like a name that people recognize, I think has a lot of value in this area, because there's just so many sources and people don't know who to trust. But we still see that very often, where people will say, oh, you're NBC, that I know I can't trust your, and that's kind of been heightened over the past 4 or 5 years, as that's been, there have been attacks specifically at news outlets. And there's not a lot we can do about that. Our job is not to sit there and defend ourselves as a news organization. Our job is to try and do the job the best we can, and try and be as even-handed as we can, and hope that speaks for itself. But I would say it's been a challenge, in recent years, especially because, depending on the day, a different news organization might be targeted, and people will be saying it's not true. And we kind of get labeled under that because we're a local NBC-owned station.
Right.
One of the things that I would say that I have tried to do in my own work, especially this past year during the election coverage, I did, some presidential election coverage, but a lot of what I was doing was covering Senate races around the country. And so what I would try to make sure to do is that, obviously just making sure that both sides and both political sides have a voice in my piece. And so one of the things, you know, I would make sure to do is if I talk to a Democratic strategist, I would also make sure to talk to a Republican strategist and try to get an equal, you know, number of voices from each side to sort of explain what is going on. Because, you know, in politics, you're always, you know, somebody's always trying to spin you in some way, but if you can sort of get, you know, an equal number of people and kind of figure it out from what everybody is telling you, and present that in sort of the most balanced way, I think that one of the things, you know, in politics that is the most important is just being fair, and try to have balance, and because, you know, whether or not people agree with you, you want to present the clearest picture of just what is going on and sort of what the political environment is. And the other thing too, I mean, what Mark was talking about a little earlier about, you know, sourcing things off of social media, I try to do that as little as possible, and try to make sure that I'm still picking up the phone and calling people. Congress reporting is great for this because a lot of times you're just in the halls of Congress, and so you can talk to staffers, or you can talk to senators or members of Congress themselves, and you know, get that information firsthand. But I think it's really important both to not just source off of social media without verifying something, and also something that can be tough in political journalism a little bit is anonymous sources, because a lot of times you have people telling you something, especially if it's a staffer or an aide, you know, they don't necessarily want their name attached to it because they're not high enough to give out that information, and basically their boss will get mad at them. And so, you know, you have a lot of people telling you stuff either off the record or on background. And I do think especially, you know, Washington is a very hyper competitive news environment. And so you have a lot of, you know, people that you're competing with reporting information off of unnamed sources. I have done that before too, you know, saying that somebody is a strategist or a pollster if they don't necessarily want their name attached to a quote. And that is something that I think, you know, I need to talk to my editors a little bit more in the future on. I try to, you know, make sure that I don't do it that often, and make sure that I have named sources in pieces as well. But I do think, again, for a lot of news consumers that this is part of our job. But sometimes when you have a quote out there and you don't have a name attached to it, it's much easier for people to doubt, you know, the truthfulness of that quote or somebody's motives behind saying that quote. And then you also do have to kind of think through these things yourself as a reporter, and basically, you know, not just let somebody go on background to trash talk, you know, somebody else. There has to be a good reason for it, but it's definitely a tough balance to strike sometimes.
Right, because the second you stop going with unnamed sources, somebody else will. And then
Absolutely, yeah.
we don't have that yet.
Yeah.
That's the challenge.
Yeah, right. No, it's a balance between being able to get the story, but also making sure that your readers know where the information is coming from, and that you as a reporter is not getting played somehow by somebody.
Yeah, and I mean, even with the elections, like because NBC is such a big organization, you know, we rely on NBC News to call the races in the presidential election. And so there at one point was the potential for the race to be called for Biden, and NBC News wouldn't have been reporting it because they hadn't called, you know, some of the states. I think it was Arizona at the time. Mm-hmm. It wound up that Philadelphia went, and that, you know, kind of solved the problem. But we could have been in a situation where we were waiting and other organizations were reporting it. And that's, you know, such a huge story. But there is a sense that, you know, we want to be right, and we're not going to risk, you know, we'll risk not being first at the expense of getting it right. And so, you know, for that, but I spent days waiting on the Arizona, come on, can we call it? Can we call it? Because I was thinking at any point, if another state went, it could have meant that the race was called, and we still would have been kind of waiting on that.
Well, you remember back to Gore and Bush very well, right? When some networks did call the election before.
Yep.
Then they had to double back.
And I think that's a big reason why NBC is more cautious about it now.
Sorry.
So I was just saying, I think that's a big reason why NBC and other networks are so cautious about it now. Yeah. They don't want to be in that position.
And this is just such a different environment today. It's such vitriol. There is such hate. I have never seen such anger among people, one side versus another, liberals versus conservatives. So I think even those labels don't really work. if you think about it. I've never seen such hatred toward a president in my life, and such a concerted effort. And I'm not, it's such a concerted effort to deny his election, if you will. That's never happened before in modern time, in my time. And I think that makes your job, Mark, and you, Ella, today even harder, because you know the people that you're talking to are very opinionated, and they want their opinion out there. It's probably good to take a breath and just remember that that opinion was not allowed on broadcast. It came about with cable, and cable successfully fought the government and said, hey, you government, you cannot control us. You can't tell us we need to abide by broadcast rules of fairness and equal time, because we don't use your airwaves. So you don't have any right. That was their argument, as I understand it, and they won. And then people like Chris Matthews and Bill O'Reilly, they wrote the script, you know, and the networks went, whoa, look at all the people we can get. We make these guys personalities, and they're the star of the show. And, you know, it's kind of like news be damned. It was just whatever those people, how best they could sell their opinion, I guess.
Yeah, they're certainly
just a really hard time to try to get fact from fiction.
For sure. Yeah, no, that shift to cable news and to, you know, the sort of the crossfires and the debate shows that have then evolved into the kind of a lot of what we have today in that realm. But let me ask you, and Ella, Mark, Natalie was just mentioning it, you know, we are a much more divided world right now. A lot of this that comes down to some degree this socially networked world we live in. People tend to get their news from like-minded sources now. You know, there are algorithms on these social platforms that kind of feed similar content to what we want to hear and this kind of stuff. And then and then I will just cite one study from MIT in 2018 that looked at the sort of the travel of misinformation and disinformation, in which they looked at, I'll just check my facts, but they studied 125,000 different stories that were identified by independent fact checkers to be false. And they found that across any category of information, whether it was politics or sports or business or anything, that false information traveled faster, farther, deeper across these networks. So how does that work? I mean, what impact does that have for you as journalists today to be operating in that environment in which the audience is potentially so divided, and there is so, you know, such the vitriol that Natalie talks about, and also the intentional disinformation? Mark, you touched briefly on it. You know, attempts to trick journalists or to just put false stories into the ecosystem that's pumping out there. What impact does that have, and how do you see that?
I mean, I would say the impact it has is, I mean, we're completely, as Natalie was saying, we're completely divided country right now, and the vitriol is at an all-time high, and it you know, that makes our jobs tougher, but I think it's more an indictment of society as a whole and a problem for society as a whole than for news organizations. It can make it, you know, a safety issue sometimes. I mean, we have reporters who go out in the field and get harassed, and you know, we now go out with security details a lot of times that we never had to do in the past, because there are situations where are angry. So I don't know that there's a way that, I'm not sure. I wish I knew how news organizations could help to solve that problem. To me, I try to do what I've always done, which is just to try and tell the truth and get the most accurate information out to people. But it's tough because I think, I can't remember, I think Tom, you were mentioning it earlier, you know, people see a headline on Facebook and they assume it's true. And it happens in my own household. And my advice is everything you see on social media, just assume it's false and then go from there, you know, back up by, you know, researching it, Google it, look it up on several sources, and see what you can find. But a lot of time I hear, people in my household say, "Can you believe this?" And I'll say, "No, I absolutely don't believe that. It's not true." And then, "No, it is." And then they'll Google it and, "Oh, wait, you know what? You're right. It's actually false." And there's an article about how this, disinformation is going around and it's a fake story. So, I mean, it's hard to cut through all of that. And I think, to Natalie's point, like it used to be, there were the big journalism outlets and people just went to them and knew that they could trust them. And now people just choose to get their information from different sources. So it's tough to cut through that sometimes. But I do think, I go back to what I said before, I think if you ask most people, they'll tell you, these are the 4 or 5 trusted sources I have. And some of them may be actual news organizations, some of them may not be as valid, but I think that's a real key, is just find those trusted sources and don't, rely on everything you see on social media.
I would say a couple of things here. One of the things to sort of go from Mark's point about social media, I mean, we are all talking about this from a journalism standpoint, but we have to sort of recognize that some of the path forward here is more reliant on the social media companies themselves, right? And maybe that ends up being more of a partnership between websites like Facebook and Twitter and, some sort of public editor or an ombudsman. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but basically, people that sort of journalists that used to sort of oversee news organizations and kind of develop standards for news organizations, maybe having to develop standards for social media companies, because this is now places where articles are being shared. And it has been interesting to watch. I mean, just even in the few months before the election, Facebook and Twitter have now started labeling tweets or Facebook posts that are false or misleading or need more context for information. I think that is a good first step. Obviously, there's kind of this other rigorous debate on for people about what that means for free speech and what that means for censorship. And so, I don't know what the best pathway forward here is, but I do think that it's important to point out that, there's sort of our side as journalists, but then there's also how this information is being disseminated. And, there are other stakeholders here, basically. And then the other thing too, I mean, I found, Natalie, what you said earlier about sort of the rise of, talking heads and cable networks that were sort of, separate from the prior rules around broadcast, very interesting, because I mean, so much of at least the TV news industry, which we saw from the poll is where a lot of people still get their news, is really just talking heads. And it has been interesting for me to see in DC, certainly, sometimes, I have a lot of reporters that I know that are very knowledgeable, that, go on TV to share their sources. But sometimes you have people that just are good on television and maybe aren't as well sourced as other people that just kind of go on and talk about the day's news. And you basically are trying to fill this 24-hour time slot. And it ends up just sort of sometimes being shouting matches, or people, rather than saying something that is based in their own reporting and factual, it ends up, as Natalie said, just sort of being this kind of opinionated back and forth. And I don't know exactly how to fix that, because that's obviously for ratings and, money, there's financial incentives wrapped up in that. But I think, as reporters, it's certainly incumbent on us to listen more to people that we're talking to and to our sources. And, certainly if we're doing political reporting, to listen to voters and of both parties and sort of trying to understand where people are coming from. But there are a lot of different incentives and other players here in this new media ecosystem that also we need to be cognizant of as well.
That's a great point, Ella. And I'm about to turn to audience questions because we're getting a lot of really good ones. And so I'll pivot to one that kind of picks up where Ella left off a little bit. But I do just want to, I think that's a really good point that you mentioned, that a big part of this shift is where the news organizations used to control the platforms. Now, some of the most powerful platforms aren't news organizations. They're Google and Facebook and Instagram and Twitter. And so, that's a big push and pull right now, is what obligation do they have for the responsibility of the content. And Ella, as you pointed out, during the last election cycle, there was a more proactive step by a lot of those platforms to combat misinformation and disinformation. Jeff asks a question that's sort of on this theme. So does news need to be regulated to clearly identify independent news from opinion? What would be the downside? What are some solutions here, I guess, is
Well, that's the way it used to be.
Yeah.
We did identify it.
Mm-hmm.
But the world has changed. You can't go backwards. You know, you got to face what you got. Social media is not going away. Twitter's not going away. The big companies aren't going. So we need to work together with a common goal. You know, back in the beginning of news, you know, people used to ascribe to Edward R. Murrow's theory that an educated society is the best defense against tyranny. And I think we need to remember that the United States of America is the greatest experiment in freedom in the history of the world. There have always been people who would like to go toward fascism, people who would like to go toward communism. And there are examples of that all over the world. We are the leading example, the longest lasting one, of a country of liberty where everyone has opportunity. And I think this last election showed something beautiful, which was that the pollsters and some people in various forms of media wanted to group the Hispanics together as one identity, if you will. And we saw in Florida, the people who escaped communism from certain Latin American countries voted one way against socialism, for example. And we saw the people in the western part of our country voting for more socialism, if you will. We don't have time to go through the details of that, but the point being that you couldn't group all of the Hispanics in our country into one identity. And that, to me, that pleased me, because none of us fit in just one column.
Mark, Ella, what do you see as some, how do we work our way out of this? What are some?
Well, this is the tough part. Is I do feel like social media, it is a little haphazard. And I mean, we've seen, the heads of the major social media companies start to get dragged before Congress. When, Twitter in the middle of an election can start deciding, hey, you know what, today we're going to start flagging the president's tweets. They start doing it in the middle of the election instead of, where have you been the last 4 years? Why not wait till after the election? Why? And making decisions like that on the fly can really change the information that gets out to people. And Facebook, I think you mentioned, Tom, that 4 years ago, they were forced to make some changes because a lot of disinformation was getting out there. One of the other things they did was, to some extent, censored the legitimate news organizations, because our news content is not getting out to people's feeds the same way it was 4 years ago because of some of the changes they made in response to the last election. And so you'll see, far more posts. They favor posts from your friends more than the other, news outlets you might follow. And that's had a direct impact on a lot of, online news organizations, because the traffic from social media has gone down substantially. But what that also says to me is fewer people are seeing the information that they probably need to see from more trusted news sources, and they're getting more disinformation as opposed to that. So I don't want to say there needs to be some sort of regulation, but I do see a lot of chaos in the social media world, and a corporation trying to react to public backlash can make a decision on the fly that could have a dramatic impact on an election or on other policy issues.
Yeah, I'll just very quickly add, I don't know sort of what the best way forward is. I don't know if government regulation on this is better, or because there's always when these companies make decisions, there's always a profit motive involved. And as Mark said, I mean, I remember still being in local news when Facebook changed their algorithm. It was really devastating for a lot of newspapers that relied on Facebook to push out local news articles to consumers and redirect to their website. And when that went away, that it's tough for more established, national companies as well. A lot of, journalism companies at the national level also really struggled. But I think local news also was devastated by that. And so, yeah, I think, maybe more input from government, or, maybe more partnerships between newsrooms and these tech companies and social media companies to sort of, establish a better ground rules. But it's tough to force a social media company to do anything if they don't want to do it.
And I'm not sure we want to, but.
Looking through so many good questions. Yeah, someone asked, is Google the new arbiter of truth? It's sort of, let's see here. Wow, there are a lot of good questions here. Bear with me. Okay. So I guess this is, ultimately, media is a business. If people don't consume your stories, you are not valuable to your advertisers and you go out of business. Do you think there could be a better business model for media? And if so, what would it be? I mean, which kind of gets at a bigger question, right? I mean, and I'll give a little bit of background is, the shift to this online world took away a lot of the ad revenue that used to make organizations, television stations, radio stations, and newspapers profitable enough to afford their news divisions, right? And so, you've seen this particularly at the local level, where a lot of local newsrooms have had, significant budget cuts or gone out of business completely. And, the companies making the most money these days are Google and Facebook, et cetera. They're certainly drawing the lion's share of the online ad revenue.
Well, Tom, you bring up a good point, and so whoever put that question in there does. And money is a factor, and competition is what hurt television more than anything. For example, it's interesting to remember that the three networks, ABC, CBS, and NBC, had foreign correspondents, probably somewhere in the vicinity of 18 or 20, I could be wrong on the number, of people who actually lived around the world and reported those stories from wherever. Of course, I got to know Peter Jennings because I was part of that network, and he was stationed in the Mideast for many years before he went to London. So that's almost like he was what I would be in Boston. I would know where to go for a story. He could go to Nairobi or wherever he happened to be at the time, and he knew who to talk to. To the best of my knowledge, and Mark, you probably would know, the networks today do not have foreign correspondents living abroad on a full-time basis. So what you've got is the Washington reporters primarily that Ella runs into having to get their information from the people in Washington. They're all talking to each other, but no one's out there. Certainly when something breaks, it's big, the networks, of course, send somebody there to cover the story. But I'm talking about being stationed there for years.
And that's,
Mark, am I right about that?
I don't have that much, dealings with the network, but I say there probably are some overseas, bureaus, but not to the level that there used to be. But that's happened everywhere. Like Ella, you could probably talk about how, there used to be a full State House group of State House reporters in Concord, New Hampshire. And I think there's still a full, like a room for them. And there maybe is one reporter there too, and they probably aren't there that often anymore. So a lot of that expertise has kind of disappeared. But I don't, that's not anything that's going to be coming back.
Another example of kind of secondhand information.
Because the money isn't what it used to be, because there are so many sources. I don't know, business model. I don't know that there's a better business model, but this is kind of the second time I've been through this. I was in newspapers for years. Mm-hmm. The difficulty is the money is still there. So there's still money in, doing TV and TV advertising. There's still people spending money there. It's not the same as it used to be, but it still dwarfs the money that's being made on the digital side at most TV stations. So it's hard to just shift your entire business model to digital when the money's still on the other side. I think we've done a really good job of it and putting a lot of resources into the digital side, but the money is going to be, slower to come on that side. I went through this in newspapers. It was the same thing. We had, car dealerships paying big money to take out, multi-page spreads in the paper, and then Craigslist came along, and a lot of the classified ad money went away. But it took years for us to get, the newspapers to start up websites. I remember, advocating for this. We had nobody when I was starting to, dip my toes into New Hampshire presidential politics and tweeting a lot. I was the only person at the newspaper I was at who was even on Twitter and tweeting about this stuff. So it's hard to shift away from, when there's still a large amount of money on kind of the old standard to kind of just pour everything over to the other side. So I don't know that the business model is going to shift as quickly as we might like it to.
One of the things that I have been thinking about a lot lately is how do we sort of, obviously I was a local reporter. I now work in DC. That is like sometimes the career trajectory for people because you can certainly make more money, doing journalism in DC or New York. That's where a lot of the jobs are. That very well may change because of the pandemic and a shift to more remote work. I mean, I have not been in my office since March, and I will probably be going back to Capitol Hill fairly soon to do some on the ground reporting. But as far as the shift to where journalism jobs are located, I think that there is kind of this really interesting effort to revitalize local news through journalism nonprofits and online websites. And some of that takes in the old funding models of getting some ad revenue, but it's not, it's rather than it being a for-profit thing, like, newspapers are for-profit, they're trying to make a profit through advertising. These nonprofits rely on, donations and grants and things like that, and might do a mix of other ad revenue. And I think that there are a lot of really interesting nonprofits, especially as people are leaving newspapers and more newspapers are, just the newspaper industry is, there are still a lot of really great newspapers, but local news is kind of slowly dying out. And as far as the newspaper industry goes. And so a lot of people are leaving newspaper newsrooms and starting online local nonprofits themselves. So that's a very interesting model and something that gives me hope as somebody who loves local news.
I'll just jump in. First of all, to say thanks to all of the folks in the audience. We're getting a lot of good questions, and I apologize in advance if you don't hear your exact question, but hopefully I'm trying to hit
rapid fire, Tom.
Different themes, rapid fire. Here's one that actually I think might be, if I can find it again. Yes, to return to the practice of journalism itself and how it's changed a bit. This question from an anonymous attendee says, so much of journalism is getting the scoop and scooping your competition, responsibly, of course. Could Natalie talk about how that sense of competition was part of the Boston TV news scene when she was on the air? And then maybe could Mark and Ella talk about what he's seen the change from the beginning of his career in print to his work now, and Ella as well. I mean, and I guess I would just add to that a little bit about, if Natalie, if you want to share a little bit what that's like, and Mark and Ella, how do you make those decisions now? How do you decide what to chase and what to be first on and how to be first and all that?
I don't think that I don't remember being obsessed with being first. Obviously, it's in the gut of every reporter, local or otherwise. You don't want to get beat on your own turf. And yes, there were times when I got an interview that the networks didn't get, boy, that felt good. I can count that how many times that happened on one hand, maybe one finger. So yes, there's competition. But as a reporter, and Ella knows this, if you're a reporter in Boston, you know all your competition because you meet them out on the street every day covering stories. So there's a camaraderie there as well. I don't think getting the scoop was a motivating factor as much as so many other things.
I would say, it depends on the environment you're into. When I started out, my first newspaper job was at Foster's Daily Democrat, and I had an editor who would call you into his office and scream at you if you got scooped. So for me, it was always about the scoop back then. This was like small potatoes. This is like local city hall and police crime. But that was kind of how I got my start. So probably to my detriment, I still that still burns inside me to some extent. And it really bothers me if we're not first on something. And to the point where I have to rely on, some of the people I work with to kind of curb that in me and help me recognize that it's okay if we were the second person to say that there were this many coronavirus cases in Massachusetts today, because either they have your app or they don't have your app. And beating them by 5 seconds isn't going to matter. But I still am kind of ruled by that. And I find myself having to pull back a little bit because I'll see a push alert from another station before our push alert. I'll be like, what are we doing? Come on, let's go. So I think to some extent that still exists. And I think, you see that in a lot of the reporters that we have out in the field, but it's like a friendly competitive rivalry. And I think when I started out, it was more, it was a tougher environment than maybe it is now.
I would just say that I think that journalists care about scoops more than the general public does. And I think it's probably because we're all kind of type A people. But it has been interesting for me working at a place like Vox, where we do a lot of explanatory journalism. And so honestly, like we do get scoops sometimes, but we're very focused on explaining, policy and explaining issues. And so one of the things that I have seen working for Vox is that I think it is just as valuable, if not more valuable, to be able to explain something, especially something that is complex, to people in a way that they can understand clearly, rather than just, being first, but not being able to, somebody reading your story and coming away still not understanding what they just read. If it's written in a way that's hard to comprehend. So I think that is just as important. And yeah, I mean, as Mark said, we kind of all, it's something that is just ingrained in journalists. But sometimes I think you also have to try to look for, if everybody is chasing this one story and trying to be first on this one story, maybe there is a different story out there that's not getting covered as much. And so what are ways that you can distinguish yourself and not just be so hyper-focused on chasing what everyone else is doing as well?
And I'd say I've been with NBC probably 6.5 years now. And when I first got there, it was kind of rebuilding their newsroom to be more focused on breaking news. Not the newsroom, the digital side, to be more focused on breaking news. And that was what drove most of our traffic. And to Ella's point, most of what drives traffic for us now are, step back pieces when we dig into something or do an explainer or, like a video that kind of pulls together a story. And the breaking news, if there's a really unusual breaking news story, will still drive traffic, but not to the extent it did, 5-6 years ago. And probably that has a lot to do with just being so many more sources out there that are putting that information out.
For sure. Yeah, it seems like that's clearly a big growth area for journalists, and not just to be the verifier of fact, but also the kind of helping make sense of what's going on and to kind of sort through the flow of information that's coming at people.
There's enough of that.
Yeah. Let me group together the theme of a number of questions here in what may be one of our last questions is, and I'll read one here from Jean, who says, is there such a thing as an unbiased news source? How do we find these sources, and how do we assess in order to find the middle ground and get the full picture? And just to add on what others were saying, essentially, what kind of advice do you have for people about how to sort fact from fiction out there, about how to be smart news consumers? For the audience, what advice would you give for navigating this information world we live in?
I mean, I guess to start, I've kind of touched on this a little bit already, but I think the biggest thing is you don't have to disbelieve 100% of what you see on social media like I do, but have a healthy dose of that, and make sure that if you see something that seems unusual or very strange, then it probably is not true, and make sure that you're researching it in other ways. That's one key thing. But I also think just find your trusted sources. Is there? I don't know that there's any unbiased source, because we all have our own biases that we bring into everything we do, and we try very hard to be as down the middle as we can when we're reporting these things. But there's a lot of unconscious bias as well. So I don't think you could say that there's any completely unbiased news source. But I think the key is finding those sources that not just align with your personal beliefs, but that you think are fair and can be trusted. And then, if you have that, half dozen news sources, whether it's, website, TV stations or newspapers, if you develop that over time, then you feel like you're getting a pretty good picture of what the real story is. Multiple sources is key. I mean, if you're just watching MSNBC or you're just watching Fox News, you're going to get one picture and that's it. So if you balance that out, I mean, I like to watch both, but that's because I'm in the business, but I like to watch both, and it's fun for me to see how differently the same story can be portrayed. But really, it's if you can find some sources that are as unbiased as possible that you can rely on, I think that's the key.
Ella and Natalie, do either of you want to chime in on tips?
Yeah, I would just say, I think that Mark made a great point as far as, I don't think there is any like truly unbiased source, because, we are reporters filtering the news, and sometimes, especially in politics journalism, the people that you're talking to may have an agenda. I would say, on things like science and, I think it's very important to distinguish, partisan political stuff from things like, reporting on COVID. And a lot of, my colleagues that report on that talk to experts and, have experts quoted in their stories. These are people who have, degrees and are very, very knowledgeable in whatever they're doing. And I do think, to my earlier point, I think it's important for journalists to make sure that when we quote people, their names are attached to a quote. And, especially when it's something around, COVID or coronavirus or any other science-based thing, it's very important to make sure that that you have the perspective of somebody and the name of somebody that is an expert in their field. So, talking to experts, contextualizing things for people, and trying to, explain to people in ways that they can understand is also helpful.
Well, maybe as human beings, we can't be totally unbiased, but we can certainly be fair. And I never had any trouble understanding two sides to a story. I remember doing a series on abortion, for example, a 5-part series, and people were very, to this day, this was 40 years ago, are passionate on that subject. And at the end of the week, I had as many people telling me I was one side as the other. So I figured I had done a fair job. But to answer your question, Tom, to the viewer who asked that question about fairness or unbiased, I think one of the ways you can learn is to listen to both sides of an argument. And Mark alluded to that. And today you see, for example, on college campuses, people don't want to hear a speaker because they don't agree with their opinion. Well, I think that's short-sighted. If you only want to talk to yourself, save yourself $65,000 and look in the mirror, But you can learn a lot. Remember back when you were in school and you had a debating class, and one person had to take this opinion, say on the death penalty, for and against capital punishment. You learn a lot when you listen to smart people argue their point of view. And you get a lot of that argument on cable in particular today. And you can get it from opposing newspaper points of view in their editorial section. So if you really are looking for, so how do I find the truth? If you're being presented good sets of facts, you get a chance to sift through the arguments, because you're going to hear someone from one side say something, bring up a fact that the person on this side would never have brought up because it doesn't bolster their argument. Someone way smarter than I one time said, you're entitled to your own opinion, but not your own set of facts. So the difficulty is you listen to opposing points of view today is to find people who are being as factual as they can to their point of view, as opposed to just screaming their ideology or opinions on something. Does that make sense?
That does, yeah. And I would just add to all this great advice. I mean, look at the source. Journalists, as all of our journalist panelists have said today, the work of journalism is getting out and learning information from sources and verifying that information. And so when you encounter a piece of news, anywhere, online and newspaper and TV, you know, look at the sources and the evidence that the journalist is basing that report on, and that should be your key. You know, that should help you kind of, and if those sources aren't there, that'd be a first clue to, as Mark said, open up a browser and look elsewhere. Because,
you know, I wonder, you know, Ella and Mark, if you don't mind my asking, I'm not much into social media, to be perfectly honest with you. Which of the fact-checking sites, digital fact-checking sites, do you all recommend? I was, in preparation for tonight, I was looking online and Googled, and you get a long list of fact-checking sites.
I'll tell you,
I'm wondering how you would recommend, which ones you would recommend.
I'm the wrong person to ask. I don't use any of the fact checking sites. I just try to read as many pieces of information as I can on a certain subject. So if I see something on Facebook that I believe it sounds too outrageous to be true, then, you know, yes, to some extent, a lot of it is Google and trying to find, you know, different examples of the story. And a lot of that you can find out if it's not true very quickly that it's not true. It's harder to prove that it is true than it is to disprove. But I just tend to gravitate toward Google. And I don't know that there's a fact checking site that is specifically reliable. There may be, you know, when it comes to national politics, there may be sites that are, you know, better to use for that, but it's nothing that in my job I'm doing on a regular basis.
Yeah, as far as politics goes, I actually, when I was at the Concord Monitor, I used to work for PolitiFact, at least the New Hampshire version of it. So PolitiFact is good for certainly for politics related fact checking. The Washington Post has a fact checking section that's just called the Washington Post Fact Checker. I believe Snopes is another one. I don't use it as much, and I don't know if that is just political or if it's a larger array. I think Snopes might be do fact checking for non-political as well. But yeah, if people are looking for political fact checking websites, I would say PolitiFact and the Washington Post Fact Checker are one of the two biggest ones, I would say.
And I would just throw in a plug for another really good resource is BuzzFeed has a dedicated fact-checking operation as well. A reporter there actually who visited with a UNH journalism class in the spring, Jane Litvinenko, dedicates her reporting career to chasing down and debunking viral disinformation, essentially. So you pick the big story of the day, something with COVID, something with the election. And obviously they have to be careful not to amplify disinformation, but if something has sort of hit a certain virality, I don't know if that's the word, but if it's become viral enough, she'll do good old fashioned reporting techniques to talk to sources and find out whether it's true or not, and then show readers what that is. So that has been one heartening thing, I think, in journalism, is you've seen a lot of these organizations stepping in to play that public fact-checking role more prominently, certainly during election cycles and things as well. Well, we have, believe it or not, I don't know if this one is fast for the audience and for all of you panelists, but it certainly flew by for me. And apologies for all the many great questions we didn't get to ask. I will turn to our panelists if there's any last thoughts or words you wanted to add as we wrap up here. I mean, obviously this is a big topic, but journalism impacts all of us as consumers of news and information. And so it's been a pleasure to hear your thoughts on this situation.
I mean, I would just say do the work. So, I mean, there are people who see a headline and they just assume that's the story. They don't even click to find out more. And that's a lot of the, you know, when I hear somebody saying, did you see this story about, and I'm like, did you click on it? Did you read it? So do the work. So, you know, read the entire story, research it, Google it, see if you can find other sources. I'm probably reading most of the BuzzFeed fact checkers stories to debunk my family's obsession with social media generated stories. But I think that's a big part of it, is just do the work and make sure that you're not just relying on one source to get your information. Make sure that you're, you know, well read, well watched, and that's my biggest piece of advice. And other than that, it's been an honor to be here with Natalie and Ella. I'm big fans of both of your work, and this has been a pleasure. And it's always an honor to be here with you, Tom, as well.
Likewise.
Yeah, I would echo what Mark said. I think it's just most important to fact check, you know, yourself and you know, double check with another story, and also, like, sometimes it can be intimidating, but like, you know, I frequently have people reach out to me and email me, and sometimes asking questions. And, you know, reporters are also, you know, part of our role is to inform the public. So if there's something that we didn't answer, you can always feel free to email a reporter and ask.
I guess, you know, you all have great advice. And if you had to boil it all down to one word or one sentence, I would say check your source, which is what we've been saying for this past hour. And you just can't believe everything that you hear. And also, I just really hope that I was very fortunate to Art McDonald. He was the dean of New Broadcasters. He started in 1948. He was to New England what Walter Cronkite was to the United States, to the nation. And I actually wrote down his mantra, if you will. He said to me, I was lucky to have him as a mentor when I was only 20 something. Hard to believe I was ever 20 something. He said, be curious, be skeptical, but not cynical. Double check your facts, be fair, and when in doubt, don't. And he was such a gracious gentleman that he used to close his broadcasts every night. This will sound odd to you today. For your hospitality, thank you. Isn't that cool? It's another era.
Well, that's still a good way to end. So I think we'll wrap it up there. For my part, I will just say thanks to Natalie, Ella, and Mark for, you know, one of the great things I enjoy about being at UNH is, first of all, this wealth of talented alumni who've gone off into the world and do great things, but also their willingness to share their time and experience. And so thanks to the three of you, and thanks to our audience for tuning in. A silver lining, I suppose, of this pandemic that we find ourselves in is that we can still gather in interesting and new ways. And so, yeah, thanks for joining us tonight. As I understand it, this has been recorded and will be kept online, so you can find this if you want to share it. And I think we'll also be able to provide some links to different resources that were discussed today. I'll pull together some things. And just, I would say to anyone in the audience, if there were a lot of questions, which I apologize we didn't get to. So if you want to email me, it's my first name, Tom, my last .haines @unh.edu, and I'd be happy to talk. Or any and all of you, feel free once this pandemic moves on to stop by Hamilton Smith Hall, home of the journalism program. If you haven't been around campus for 4 or 5 years, you won't believe what Hamilton Smith Hall looks like after a major renovation. It still has the beautiful white columns out front that you'll remember, but a complete state-of-the-art classroom for today's students. So, and I would just say too, because these are interesting times, that rest assured, UNH is alive and well. We just are closing up an unusual but successful semester. A lot of great leadership on behalf of the university, got testing very rigorously on campus, and so students were able to be on campus. We were able to teach classes more or less in person. I taught a reporting workshop with 11 students this fall, like an upper level reporting workshop, and we met with our masks 6 feet apart. But students were still doing a lot of interviewing by Zoom and by phone, more than in person. But and I think, you know, and they're all now wrapping up the semester, and we hope to be back in the spring. So
that's great.
Still a good day to be a Wildcat, even during these trying times. So thanks everybody, and thanks very much for tuning in. And Mark and Ella and Natalie, I'll see you around on the next go around. Good night, everybody.
Thank you, Tom, for doing this.
Thank you.